In this video, I'm going to show you how to replace the front brakes on this GMC Yukon. Let's get started. Take a 22mm socket and remove all 6 of your lug nuts. With those off, remove the wheel. Now with the wheel off, if you look on the back side of the caliper, you'll see 2 19mm bolts. So it holds your caliper onto the bracket. So put a wrench or a socket on here and break it free. Take one out, but I will leave it partially threaded on to hold the caliper while I take the top one off. Now carefully take the bottom one out, set it aside, pull outwards just a little bit on the caliper. That'll usually squish the pistons in and leave you with just enough wiggle room to pull it off. And now you're going to want to set it right on top of this upper control arm here. Careful of your ABS wire, you don't want to damage it, but this is going to be a secure place for it to stay while you do the brake job because you don't want to put any pressure on this brake hose, and since it's attached with the bracket here, it can't really go too far. Now you can pull the brake pads out, just wiggle them, and they should come out. They do have a little stopper on both top and bottom, so sometimes you'll need a little bit of a prying tool to get these out of here. There we go. Now you have 2 18mm bolts to remove to get this caliper bracket out. I'm going to leave that one partially threaded in so I can take this one out. Pull this one out completely, hold the bracket, finish removing this one, and then once this is out, you should be able to pull the bracket right out of here. These rotors have a T30 Torx bolt in them that holds them onto the hub. So take a T30 bit and remove this bolt. Mine has clearly been out before, but if yours hasn't and it's stuck, if you have an impacting screwdriver, that can help because you can actually hammer down as it's trying to spin. If not, take a punch, tap with the punch on the head of the bolt. That usually shocks the threads inwards and hopefully gets this to break free. With that off, we can remove the rotor. Now let's clean the hub surface. There's a lot of anti-seize on here, but underneath it, you should have a clean hub. So whether that means you're gonna have to wire brush it, wire wheel it, sand it, whatever you're doing, basically it needs to look like this underneath. I'm just gonna wipe off the old anti-seize and apply new anti-seize. If there was none, hopefully it's not rusty. Basically, the reason I'm coating it is because I don't want the rotor to seize on the hub, but also if you don't coat it, rust can build up here. It'll swell, and then the rotor won't sit flush on the hub anymore. Then you'll get weird braking issues. So you want to avoid that, make everything nice and clean. Now that I've wiped it down for the most part, I'm going to take some brake parts cleaner and rinse this all off. This looks really good, so I'm going to coat it with some fresh anti-seize. Now you want to focus on this outer ridge as well as the inner right here. The center is recessed in on this hub, so it's not as important, but I'm still going to coat it so that it prevents any rust from building up in the future, because that area too can rust. It just won't touch the rotor, so it won't affect it as much. Try to avoid getting it on the lug studs. You don't really want anti-seize all over those threads. I'm going to put a bunch of anti-seize inside the threads of this set screw for the rotor, hoping that will prevent it from seizing in the future. I'm also going to put anti-seize on its threads when it's time for it to go back on, but this is just a little extra. Take your new rotor, slide it on, make sure you line up the hole for the set screw with its threads. And speaking of, let's drive this in. Just make it a little bit snug. That's all you need. It's just there to hold the rotor until you put the wheel on. Now let's clean up the caliper bracket on my workbench here. I'm going to take the anti-rattle clips off on both sides. Set those aside. And now with a wire brush, I'm going to gently clean off this surface here. Mine's not too bad, but it does have some surface rust. So I just want to get that out of here, as well as the gunky buildup of brake dust and grease that is here. And of course, we'll flip it over and do the same to the other side. Rinse this with brake parts cleaner. Once it dries up, put a thin layer of silicone paste or brake grease, whatever you have. I have high temperature silicone paste that I'm using, and the reason I'm doing this is to prevent further rust from building up. Now you want a thin layer here, because if you put too much, when you put the new anti-rattle clips on, it'll actually squeeze out onto the rotor. This right here is probably a little too much. Just a thin coating, enough to prevent rust from building up in the future, like I said. And with that done, put the new anti-rattle clips on. Make sure they line up and snap on. They should be completely locked in place. If they don't sit down flush, well, then you'll have a problem with the brake pads fitting. Make sure no grease got in the middle here. That's where the rotor rides, and you don't want any grease getting on the rotor. Now with that done, I'm going to sit the caliper bracket upright, and we're going to take the slider pins out, inspect them. These are still covered in grease, which is a good thing. A lot of times they will seize up, especially if these boots go bad, if they are in poor condition or torn. Now these are not the greatest, and they're not clean, that's for sure, but they're not bad. So if yours are bad, as in swollen or torn and damaged in any way, really, you're going to want to replace them. I'm not going to bother cleaning out too much of the grease in there. It's still good grease. What I'm going to do is apply new grease to the slider pin. Now I'm using silicone paste. Once again, if you have brake grease, you can use that. Coat the slider pin, and then I like to take some extra grease and pack it inside there. This is gonna act as a reserve of grease. Take the slider pin, push it in all the way, and give it a couple twists. This will work the grease in there. And then of course, we're gonna wanna do the same to the other slider pin. Take this out, plenty of good grease in here. I'm just gonna wipe it clean. Make sure this ridge at the top is clean and free of any rust. A lot of times the ridge will rust and then it won't seal up against the boot. I'm gonna clean inside the boot. Put some grease on the pin and add some grease in there. You know, you can put as much as you want. Try not to put too much. A lot of times if you put too much though, it'll just squeeze out as you put the slider in. If you'll notice, as I'm pressing it down, it'll release air. That's good, that's normal. You don't want air trapped down here because it'll push the slider out. Give these a quick wipe. Now we can put this bracket back on the vehicle. Get the bracket over the rotor, whichever bolt hole lines up first, start the bolt on, so you can then let go and put on the other one. There we go. Snug these up. If you have the light duty suspension, you're going to want to torque these to 170 foot-pounds. If you have the heavy duty suspension, these get torqued to 221 foot-pounds. That's one and two. When you put the brake pads in, the inner one will have an extra piece of backing plate below the pad surface. The outer one will not. You can't really put them on backwards anyway, just because they literally won't fit. Also, the inner one, make sure that the squealer is on the bottom, or wear indicator, if that's what you want to call it. Slide them into the anti-rattle clips here, into the bracket. They should slide on nice and smooth. If they don't, that means you didn't clean up here and here enough. There's a lot of rust buildup, and they're actually being squished together, which is going to prevent them from moving freely under normal brake operation. So you're going to want to go back and clean some more. Now I'm going to put the caliper on the top slider pin. I can't put it on completely because I haven't pushed the pistons back yet. And the reason I do this is so that I can have it stay here without floating around everywhere as I'm trying to squeeze the pistons in. It'll stay attached. Now, careful of the pads. You don't want to damage anything here. But now we can pop the bleeder screw cap off. Now put your 10mm wrench on here, and I'm going to choose to put a little piece of hose just so I can direct the flow of brake fluid. Crack this open. This should allow fluid to flow through. As you can see, it's even bubbling up some air that was in the caliper, so that's a good thing. Now the collection bucket underneath. I have two pistons here, so I'm going to use a dual piston caliper depression tool. However, I'm also going to put an old brake pad in just to take up some of the space. If you don't have this special tool, you can do it with anything else that'll basically clamp on, large pliers if you have, but just be very careful because you want to press evenly between the two pistons. If you press unevenly, well, it could push one out as it's pushing the other one in, so just be careful. Now just compress these all the way in until they bottom out. That's pretty much here. Get your tool out. I'm going to get my old brake pad out of here. Oh, the caliper wants to go over the new pads now, so that's good. So in that case, I'm going to leave this pad in here to prevent it from doing that. I'm going to close off my bleeder screw. Since I used the hose, no air made its way back in because this was full of fluid, so even if it did pull some in, it pulled fluid, not air. Take this off, take this off, lift the caliper up, set it down on the pads. Don't forget about the little bleeder screw cap here. Now get the bottom bolt threaded back in. Let's bottom these out. And the top one. The torque for these two, since we have the light duty version, is 74 foot-pounds. If you had the heavy duty suspension, it would be 77. Looks like I have to hold the slider pin in place. It's spinning. You can hold it with a 19mm wrench. That's one. Try to gently get the wrench in here without damaging the boot. There we go. And that's the second one. Now do the same to the other side. Top off that master cylinder, pump up the brake pedal, and let's put the wheels on. Let's get the wheels back on. Put on all 6 of your lug nuts, and then in a cross pattern, torque them to 140 foot-pounds. $140 foot-pounds in a cross pattern. Here we go. And it's always a good idea to double check them. This time you don't have to go in a cross pattern though. All right, now take it for a road test and of course, get an alignment.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.